Historians enlarged this 1875 photo, what they found between the boys. Hands broke their hearts. Dr. Rachel Morrison had been working at the Pennsylvania Historical Society for 7 years, but she had never ventured into Archive Room D, the windowless space on the building's lowest level had been closed for renovation since before her arrival, its contents packed away and largely forgotten. Now, with the restoration complete, boxes were being returned to newly installed climate-controlled shelving. Rachel pulled on cotton gloves and opened the first container marked Philadelphia Institutions, 1870 to 1880. Inside were dozens of photographs, most showing austere brick buildings, stern-faced administrators, and occasionally, groups of children staring blankly at the camera, orphanages, reform schools, workhouses, the Victorian-era's solution to poverty and abandonment. She lifted each photograph carefully, making notes for the digital catalog. Most were standard institutional documentation, the kind of images taken annually to show donors and city officials that children were being properly housed and fed. The faces in these photos rarely smiled. Children in that era were taught to remain still and serious before the camera, but there was something else in their eyes, a flatness, a resignation. Then Rachel found a photograph that made her pause. 3 boys stood in a row in front of a large brick building. The image was sharper than most from that period, the details remarkably preserved. The boys appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old. They wore identical gray wool suits that hung loosely on their thin frames, their hair cut short and uneven. Their faces held the same blank expression she'd seen in dozens of other photos, but their hands were different. The boys stood close together, their arms at their sides, but their hands weren't simply hanging loose. They were positioned deliberately, fingers touching, creating a chain between the 3 of them. And there, in the small space where their fingers met, something was visible. A tiny edge of white paper. Rachel reached for her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The paper was folded multiple times, compressed to fit in the smallest possible space. It was deliberately hidden, meant to be concealed from whoever was taking the photograph. She turned the image over. Written in faded ink, St. Vincent's Home for Boys, Philadelphia, September 12, 1875. Rachel set up her equipment on the conservation table, a high-resolution scanner, digital microscope, and her laptop loaded with image enhancement software. The photograph, despite its age, was in remarkable condition. The albumin print process used in 1875 had preserved details that might have been lost with other methods. She began with a full scan at maximum resolution, then imported the file into her enhancement program. Modern technology could reveal details invisible to the naked eye, extracting information from shadows, reflections, and the smallest variations in tone and contrast. Rachel zoomed in on the boy's hands. The image pixelated briefly, then resolved into crystalline clarity. The paper was definitely there, folded and pressed between the fingers of the boy in the middle and the boy on his right. Even more intriguing, she could now see markings on the visible edge, what appeared to be numbers or letters, though most were obscured by the fold. She spent the next hour adjusting contrast, sharpening edges, and filtering out noise from the scan. Slowly, fragments of text emerged. She could make out what looked like the number 4 and possibly the letter B or R. Rachel sat back and stared at the screen. Why would 3 boys hide a piece of paper in a photograph? Who were they trying to communicate with? She opened the Historical Society's database and searched for St. Vincent's Home for Boys. The institution had operated from 1868 to 1892 in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, housing orphaned and abandoned children. It had been run by the Catholic Church, funded partially by the city and partially by private donation. The records were sparse intake logs, some financial documents, a few letters from administrators. But Rachel found an annual report from 1875, published just months after this photograph was taken. She downloaded the PDF and began reading. The report painted St. Vincent's as a model institution. Clean dormitories, regular meals, basic education, and preparation for productive Christian lives. Children were taught trades and placed in apprenticeships or adopted by respectable families. But buried in the financial section was an interesting note. Placement fees received $1,840. Rachel did quick math. At roughly $20 per child, that meant approximately 90 children had been placed that year. 90 children sent somewhere. But where? Rachel arrived at St. Vincent's Parish office on a gray Wednesday morning. The orphanage building itself had been demolished in 1910, replaced by row houses, but the church remained. Father Thomas, an elderly priest who managed the parish archives, greeted her in the dusty record room behind the sacristy. "We don't get many researchers asking about the old orphanage," he said, pulling a leather-bound ledger from a shelf. Most of the records were lost in a fire in 1918. What we have is incomplete. Rachel explained about the photograph. Father Thomas opened the ledger, running his finger down pages of names written in careful script. September 1875, you said? September 12th, specifically. He turned pages, squinting at the faded ink. Here, September entries. The page listed children's names, ages, dates of admission, and most importantly, dates of departure and destination. Rachel leaned in. Her eyes scanned the entries for boys aged 8 to 12 who had left the orphanage in late September or early October 1875. There, 3 names. Thomas Murphy, age 10, departed September 24th, 1875. Placement, Western family. Below it, Daniel O'Brien, age 11, departed September 24th, 1875. Placement, Western family. And finally, James Kelly, age 9, departed September 24th, 1875. Placement, Western family. All 3 boys, gone on the same day, just 12 days after the photograph was taken. All sent to unspecified Western family. Father, do you have any records of these Western families? Names, addresses, correspondence? Father Thomas shook his head slowly. That's the problem with these old placement records. Western family was a catch-all term used by many orphanages. Sometimes it meant legitimate adoptions. Sometimes ... double quotes he trailed off. Sometimes what? Sometimes it meant that children were sent to work. Farm labor, factory work, mining. The orphanages received placement fees, and the families or employers got cheap labor. It wasn't adoption. It was indentured servitude. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. How common was that? Very common, I'm afraid. Thousands of children were sent west every year on what they called orphan trains. Some found loving homes, many did not. And once they left Philadelphia, there was no follow-up, no oversight. They simply disappeared from the records. Rachel looked at the photograph she'd brought, at the 3 boys with their hidden message. Thomas, Daniel, and James. Just 12 days after this photo was taken, they had vanished. Rachel spent the next week immersed in research about the orphan train movement. What she discovered was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were transported from East Coast cities to the Midwest and West. The program was started with good intentions, rescuing children from poverty and overcrowded orphanages, giving them fresh starts in rural communities. But the reality was far more complicated. She found first-hand accounts from former orphan train riders, recorded in the 1970s and 80s. Some spoke of kind families who raised them as their own children. Others described lives of brutal labor working dawn to dusk on farms, beaten for the smallest mistakes, denied education, treated worse than livestock. One testimony particularly struck her. A man named William described being sent from a New York orphanage to a farm in Nebraska in 1878. We were lined up at the train station like cattle at auction. Families would examine us, check our teeth, feel our arms for muscle. I was 9 years old. The farmer who took me worked me 16 hours a day. I slept in the barn. I never went to school again. Rachel found train manifests from 1875. Passenger lists that included groups of children traveling with chaperones from various charitable organizations. In late September 1875, a train had departed Philadelphia's Broad Street station bound for Pittsburgh, with stops planned in smaller Pennsylvania towns. The manifest listed 23 children from St. Vincent's home among the passengers. 23 children, including presumably Thomas Murphy, Daniel O'Brien, and James Kelly. But the manifest didn't list final destinations. Once the train left Philadelphia, the children's fates became impossible to track through official records alone. Rachel pulled up the photograph again and studied the boys' faces with new understanding. They had known something was coming. Somehow they had known they were about to be sent away, and they had tried to leave a message. She zoomed in once more on the hidden paper between their hands. The fragment of visible text nagged at her. She needed to see what was written on that paper. But how could she read text on a piece of paper photographed 149 years ago, folded and hidden? Then she remembered forensic document analysis. Dr. Alan Shen's laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania specialized in historical document recovery. His team had developed techniques for reading burned scrolls, faded manuscripts, and palimpsest documents where newer text had been written over older erased writing. If anyone could extract text from a photograph of a hidden folded paper, it was Alan. Rachel met him in his lab, where computer screens displayed various ancient texts in different stages of analysis. She explained the situation and showed him her enhanced images. Alan studied them carefully. "This is unusual. We're not trying to read a damaged document. We're trying to read a document within a photograph. But there might be a way. He loaded the image onto his main computer system. Modern photography is digital, composed of pixels. But this albumin print is analog. It captured continuous tones through chemical reactions on the paper. That means information exists beyond what's visible to human eyes. He began applying filters, adjusting wavelengths, analyzing the microscopic variations in the photographic emulsion. The paper between their fingers is white or light-colored, which means it reflected more light during the exposure. If there's writing on it, the ink would have absorbed light differently. That creates subtle tonal variations we might be able to enhance. Hours passed. Rachel watched as Alan worked through dozens of different analytical approaches. Several times, promising patterns emerged only to dissolve into noise when he tried to sharpen them further. Then, as evening light faded outside the lab windows, something appeared on the screen. "There," Alan said, pointing. "Look at this section where the paper's edge is visible." Rachel leaned in. On the tiny exposed corner of the folded paper, enhanced and magnified, text was visible. Not much, just fragments, but readable. She could make out ... for B ... September 26th. Pitt no ... double quotes. Her heart raced. "Can you get more?" "Maybe. Give me another hour." Rachel waited, barely breathing as Alan refined the image further. Slowly, more characters emerged. The number 4B was clear now. Below it, September 26th, and then Pitt no 7. And at the bottom, in slightly larger letters, a single word, "help." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. The boys had known exactly where they were being sent. They had known the date. They had known they needed help. And they had hidden this message in the only photograph that might preserve their plea, hoping someone someday would look closely enough to see it. Rachel barely slept that night. By morning, she had compiled a list of coal mining operations in western Pennsylvania that had been active in 1875. The region's anthracite and bituminous coal industry was at its peak, supplying fuel for America's rapidly industrializing cities. Coal mining in the 1870s was deadly work. Cave-ins, gas explosions, floods, and equipment failures killed thousands of workers annually. But the most vulnerable workers weren't the adult miners, they were the children. Boys as young as 8 worked as breaker boys, sitting in massive coal breakers for 10 to 12 hours a day, picking slate and debris from coal as it rushed past them. Their fingers bled constantly. Many lost fingers to the machinery. The coal dust destroyed their lungs. Others worked as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors in pitch-black mine shafts, or as mule drivers, leading pack animals through dangerous tunnels. Rachel found a report from Pennsylvania's Bureau of Labor Statistics from 1876, just a year after the boys' photograph. It estimated that over 20,000 children worked in the state's coal mines. The report included testimony from mine inspectors, company officials, and occasionally, the children themselves. One interview stood out. A mine inspector described visiting a breaker facility. Boys aged 8 to 14 sit hunched over coal chutes in clouds of black dust. Many show signs of malnutrition. When asked about their origins, several stated they had come from orphanages in Philadelphia. The company's superintendent explained these boys were apprenticed for room, board, and minimal wages, most of which was sent back to the institutions that placed them. Rachel felt sick. St. Vincent's had received placement fees for sending children into this hell. She cross-referenced mine names with the notes text, 4B and Pitt no 7. Several possibilities emerged, but one facility matched perfectly. The Blackstone Coal Company operated 4 breaker buildings in Scranton. Designated A through D Building 4B would be Breaker 4. Section B and company maps from 1875 showed Pitt no 7 was one of their deepest shafts. Rachel found a contact for the Lackawanna Historical Society in Scranton. They maintained extensive coal mining archives. She emailed them immediately, attaching enhanced images of the photograph and explaining what she discovered. The response came within hours. "We have accident reports and worker rosters from Blackstone Coal Company. When can you visit?" The Lackawanna Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion overlooking downtown Scranton. Margaret Sullivan, the archivist, met Rachel at the door with a grim expression. "I pulled everything we have on Blackstone Coal Company from 1875 to 1880. It's not pleasant reading." She led Rachel to a research room where boxes of documents covered a long table ledgers, accident reports, company correspondence, and most significantly, worker rosters listing names, ages, and positions. Rachel started with the September 1875 roster for Breaker 4B. Her hands trembled as she turned the fragile pages. The list included dozens of boys, many with Irish surnames. She scanned the names looking for Thomas Murphy, Daniel O'Brien, and James Kelly. There. Murphy Thomas, age 10, breaker boy. Start date: September 26, 1875. The date from the hidden note: September 26th, exactly 14 days after the photograph was taken. She found the other two names immediately below. O'Brien, Daniel, age 11, breaker boy, September 26, 1875, and Kelly, James, age 9, breaker boy, September 26, 1875. All three boys, assigned to the same work shift, starting on the exact date they had written in their hidden message. Margaret stood beside her. Look at the accident reports. That's where the real story is. Rachel opened the first accident ledger, dated October through December 1875. The entries were brief, clinical. October 18th, hand injury, Collins, breaker boy. November 3rd, crushed foot, Romano, mule driver. November 29th, death by asphyxiation, Werner, age 13, Pitt, no 7. She turned more pages, her dread growing. Then, on December 14th, 1875, death by machinery accident, Kelly, James, age 9, breaker 4B. Body recovered and buried in company cemetery. James Kelly, dead less than 3 months after arriving, just 9 years old. Rachel's vision blurred with tears. She forced herself to keep reading. 2 months later, February 1876. Death by Caven, Murphy, Thomas, age 10, Pitt, no 7. Body not recovered. And finally, April 1876. Death by pneumonia, O'Brien, Daniel, age 11, company hospital. Buried in company cemetery. All three boys. Dead within 7 months of being sent from St. Vincent's orphanage. Their hidden plea for help had gone unnoticed, their message invisible for 149 years. Rachel stood in an overgrown field on the outskirts of Scranton. This had been Blackstone Coal Company's burial ground for workers who died without family to claim them. Now it was abandoned, surrounded by chain-link fence, marked only by a small historical marker placed by a local preservation group in the 1990s. Margaret had come with her, along with a volunteer from the preservation group named Tom, who carried a metal detector and ground-penetrating radar equipment. "We've been trying to locate and mark the graves here for years," Tom explained. "But the company kept poor records. We estimate 200 people are buried here, mostly children and immigrant workers. Very few graves have markers. They walk through knee-high weeds. Here and there, small weathered stones poked through the grass, most with illegible inscriptions." Tom set up his equipment and began scanning methodically. "According to the burial records you found," he said to Rachel, "James Kelly and Daniel O'Brien should be in the southwestern section. No record of Thomas Murphy because his body wasn't recovered from the cave-in." Rachel thought about that, a 10-year-old boy, buried alive in a collapsed mine shaft, never even given a proper grave. The injustice of it burned in her chest. Tom's radar unit beeped. Got something here. Definitely a burial, about 3 feet down, small, consistent with a child. He marked the spot with a flag and moved on. Over the next hour, he located 17 probable graves in the area, all unmarked. "Is there any way to know which ones are James and Daniel?" Rachel asked. "Not without excavation, which would require permits, family permission if we could find any descendants, and funding we don't have." Tom paused. "But we can mark this section. Note who's likely buried here based on the records you found. At least then, they're not completely forgotten." Rachel knelt in the grass, looking at the small flags marking invisible graves. 3 boys had stood together for a photograph, had hidden a desperate message between their hands, had been sent away and worked to death. Thomas, Daniel, and James. Just children. "They tried to tell someone," she said quietly. "They knew what was coming, and they tried to get help." Margaret touched her shoulder gently. "Now, because of you, people will know. Their story won't stay buried." Back in Philadelphia, Rachel expanded her investigation. If St. Vincent's had sent children to coal mines, what about other orphanages? She began systematically searching records from institutions across the city, Catholic, Protestant, and secular. What she found was staggering. Between 1870 and 1880, at least 12 Philadelphia orphanages had sent children west on orphan trains. The placement records were vague, but cross-referencing with coal company rosters revealed a pattern. Hundreds of boys had ended up in Pennsylvania's mining region. Many had died. Rachel found a letter in the archives of the Pennsylvania Coal Association, dated 1877. From a mine superintendent to an orphanage director, "We are pleased with the last group of boys you sent. They are strong workers and cause less trouble than adult minors. We would like to receive 20 more boys next spring. Payment arrangements as before. Payment arrangements. The orphanages were selling children. Not all institutions participated. Some records showed careful vetting of adoptive families, follow-up correspondence, even visits to ensure children's well-being. But others had clearly seen the orphan train system as a lucrative business opportunity. Rachel contacted other historical societies in coal mining regions, West Virginia, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. They all had similar stories. Orphan train children working in mines, factories, and dangerous industrial operations. High mortality rates. Mass graves of unnamed children. She compiled her findings into a comprehensive report, documenting everything from the initial photograph to the death records, from the hidden message to the company cemetery. The report was 70 pages long, dense with evidence and citations. But facts alone wouldn't convey the human tragedy. Rachel returned to the original photograph, studying the boys' faces once more. Thomas, Daniel, and James. 3 children who deserved better than history had given them. She noticed something she'd missed before. Daniel, the oldest boy in the center, wasn't just holding the hidden note between his fingers. His expression, while maintaining the blank stare required by the photographer, showed something else in his eyes. Not hopelessness, not resignation, defiance, even knowing what was coming, even understanding they were powerless to stop it. He and his friends had found a way to resist. They had left evidence. They had fought back in the only way they could, with a tiny piece of paper and desperate hope that someday someone would see. The exhibition opened at the Pennsylvania Historical Society on a cold November morning, exactly 149 years after the photograph had been taken. Rachel had worked with the museum's design team to create something powerful and intimate, a single room. Dimly lit, with the photograph projected large on one wall, visitors entered and were confronted immediately with the image. 3 boys in gray suits. Standing close, their hidden message now visible thanks to the digital enhancement displayed beside it. The words, "Help" and "Pit No 7" glowed softly in the darkened room. The walls displayed Rachel's research, the orphanage records, the train manifests, the mine company rosters, the accident reports. Each boy's story was told. Thomas Murphy, lost in a cave-in at age 10. Daniel O'Brien, dead from pneumonia at 11 after months breathing coal dust. James Kelly, crushed in machinery at age 9. But the exhibition didn't stop with their deaths. Rachel had located descendants of several other children sent on the same orphan train. Some had survived, had built lives, had families who never knew their ancestors' origins. These descendants had contributed photographs, letters, and stories to the exhibition. One wall was dedicated to the wider context, the thousands of children sent west, the mortality rates, the institutional complicity, the economic incentives that had turned orphan children into commodities. Rachel had also included reform efforts that eventually emerged. Laws passed in the 1920s and 30s to protect child workers, and the orphan train system's eventual end. A local news crew filmed Rachel's curator talk on opening day. These 3 boys knew they needed help, and they found an ingenious way to ask for it. They couldn't speak aloud, the photograph required silence. They couldn't write a letter, they had no money for postage and no way to mail it without being caught. So they hid their message in plain sight, hoping that someday technology would advance enough for someone to read it. A journalist raised her hand. "Why do you think this story matters now, 149 years later?" Rachel looked at the projected image of the boys. Because they were children who believed their lives mattered enough to fight for. Because systems existed that treated them as disposable, and we need to remember those systems so we never recreate them. And because 3 boys found courage and friendship, they stood together, literally linked by their hands, facing an unknown future. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. Every year, thousands of children in this country enter foster care, face poverty, suffer exploitation. The specific circumstances change, but the vulnerability remains. These 3 boys remind us that children in crisis are trying to tell us they need help. We just have to look closely enough to see their messages. The exhibition ran for 6 months and was visited by over 50,000 people. The Pennsylvania Historical Society created an online memorial where visitors could leave reflections. Teachers brought school groups. Descendants of orphan train riders traveled from across the country to share their family stories. Tom from the Scranton Preservation Group raised funds to place a proper memorial stone in the company cemetery, listing the names of all the children whose burial locations had been identified through Rachel's research. The dedication ceremony drew 200 people. But for Rachel, the most meaningful moment came when she received an email from an elementary school teacher in Pittsburgh. Her 4th grade class had studied the exhibition virtually and created artwork responding to it. She attached a photo of one student's drawing, 3 boys holding hands, with the words "We see you" written above them in careful letters. Rachel printed the drawing and placed it beside the original photograph in her office. Thomas, Daniel, and James had hidden their message 149 years ago between their clasped hands. Now finally someone had answered. Not with rescue, that was impossible across the gulf of time, but with something perhaps equally important. Remembrance, recognition, and the promise that their lives, however brief and unjust, would not be forgotten. The photograph remained ordinary in many ways, just 3 boys in institutional clothing staring at a camera. But now, when people looked at it, they saw what the boys had needed them to see. They saw courage, friendship, and a plea that had waited nearly a century and a half to be heard.